What are you doing down there?
I've given up on chairs.
Ever since 1928, Imperial Japan, specifically its army, had been experimenting with the idea of a tank that could go on land, but also on water. Several were made, but from what I know, only as one-off prototypes. They tested these as a concept in the 30s, but interest them, at least for the army, started to drop. However, the Imperial Navy would pick the project back up in 1940 with the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu leading. They would use the knowledge that the army gathered in the 30s and build on top of it, using the Type 95 Hago light tank as their base, and come up with the Type 1 Misha. Now, one of the biggest changes that they made with the Type 1 was that instead of using rivets, they actually welded most of the body and then used rubber seals to make it watertight. The Type 1 wasn't really adequate though, which led to the Navy developing the Type 2 Kami in 1941, and in 1942 they produced 184 units. Now the Type 2 was acceptable by the Navy standards, with 6 to 13 millimeters of frontal armor, a Type 1 37mm gun which was able to penetrate 25 millimeters of armor within 1,100 yards. It also had 2 Type 97 machine guns. Now for its engine, it used an air-cooled 6-cylinder Mitsubishi engine and could reach a maximum speed of 37 kilometers per hour on land and just 10 kilometers per hour in the water. Now you might have noticed from the pictures this weird chimney-like structure behind the hub. Well, that's exactly what it was. A chimney housed right above the engine, which actually allowed air in to cool it and also keep water out. Now a crew of 5 was needed to operate it to its full capacity, and was a tad under 7.5 meters in length if it had its flotation pontoons, 4.8 meters without them, and weighed 13.3 tons or 9 and 15 tons without the pontoons. Okay, you might be asking, what is a pontoon? Well, to put it very simply, it's a portable float. The Kami had them in the front and back and was able to detach them once it touched land. Now what's cool about them was that the front pontoon was actually separated into 2 sections that were then divided into 3 compartments to minimize any flooding that could actually happen in case enemy fire penetrated it. Japanese tanks don't really have a good reputation, but the Kami has actually been described as one of the best designed amphibious tanks of the war. Now, you can take that however you like though. While the rate at which the Imperial Japanese Navy came up with their first amphibious tanks and then go on to make an even better model just a year later is very impressive, it actually came too late to be used in the role of aggressive amphibious landings on islands without proper ports, like they had originally been intended for. The first combat mission the Kami saw was at the Guadalcanal in late 1942, though it doesn't seem like it performed well. Now, I have read somewhere that this is because it was deployed in incredibly low numbers there. I think 9 is what I've actually read. After this, they were relegated as infantry support vehicles and as mobile pillboxes for the rest of the war. Kind of a waste if you think about it. So I know I've made the Kami seem like crap, but honestly, all amphibious tanks in World War II were crap. The Kami was actually just one of the best, if not the best, of the war. Now, if you compare it to the American LVT-1, it actually had slightly better armor, was slightly faster on land, and the Type 1 37mm gun, well, it could cause a lot more damage to vehicles than the LVT's 50 cal machine guns. Now, here's the crazy thing. You'd think that this was the end of Japanese amphibious tanks, right? Well, it wasn't. I mean, they produced less than 200 of the Kami, and they weren't even using them consistently as amphibious tanks. But they did. Well, kind of. Anyway, the Imperial Japanese Navy actually really loved the Kami and thought that considering that the concept of the Type 2 was at least a success, that a bigger, stronger replacement was in order. This time they would base the chassis on the newest medium tank, the Type 1 Chihi. They completed the prototype in 1943, dubbing it the Type 3 Kaichi, and would then have it enter service later that same year. But what made the Type 3 different? Well, for starters, it actually had 2 additional wheels and return rollers, and was 10.3 meters in length with its pontoons, and 3 meters in width. It also boasted 50 millimeters of frontal armor with 10 to 50 millimeters of armor in all the other areas, depending on where we're talking. It also had their Type 1 47 millimeter gun attached to it, which could penetrate 55 millimeters of armor at 110 yards, and for its secondary weapons it had 2 Type 97 7.7 millimeter machine guns. To move its roughly 29-ton body, Mitsubishi gave it a Type 100 240 horsepower V12 diesel engine and had the exact same speed as its predecessor, which isn't bad considering the size and armor upgrade. Now, what's really cool about this guy was its ability to be transported via submarine, even if the submarine was submerged. Now, could you imagine that? Okay, imagine you're an American in the Pacific. You just took a small island. You look at the ocean, there's nothing there. You look at the trees, nothing there. You think to yourself, awesome, nothing to worry about. Then, all of a sudden, these start to pop out of the water and start swimming towards you, guns blazing. Absolute nightmare. Thankfully, these never saw combat, well, at least for us Americans. And only 19 were ever built. The Navy moved on from their production as their focus was now on warships and aircraft. And for the rest of the war, these tanks were actually used to ferry cargo around the Japanese islands covertly. Sadly, they were all scrapped, so we only have pictures of them now. The experience of the Solomon Islands in 1942 showed the Imperial Navy just how difficult it could be to supply their men in certain conditions. This prompted the IJN to look into a way to fix this. That way became the Type 4 Katsu, which wasn't really a tank. Instead, it was an amphibious tractor able to transport cargo and men, well, anywhere. It weighed 14.5 tons with a length of 11 meters and a width of 4 meters, and a 120 horsepower engine. Considering its primary purpose wasn't to be a fighting vehicle, it shouldn't really surprise anyone that it only had 10 millimeters of armor. That isn't to say it was defenseless though, because it did have 2 13 millimeter machine guns, should it ever need them. The first prototype was completed in the later half of 1943, and 40 to 50 of them were actually completed in 1944. Now, by this time, Imperial Japan was in dire straits against the United States. So it was proposed that they use the Katsu to attack American ships anchored at ports in atolls that couldn't be attacked through regular means. They do this by equipping them with a pair of torpedoes. They learned a lot from the Kaichi's design and made the Katsu be able to be launched from submarines as well, where they could then be used in surprise attacks. The tests that were carried out were actually successful. However, the war had ended before any of these attacks could be carried out, thankfully for those sailors. The last amphibious vehicle that the Empire would try to make would be dubbed the Type 5 Toku. A prototype was made in the beginning of 1945. It would be built on the chassis of the Type 5 Chiri, with 50 millimeters of frontal armor and the Type 1 47mm gun, though it's possible that this would have actually been upgraded to the 57mm, and it actually was going to have a secondary 25mm cannon as well, and would have 2 Type 97 machine guns. It was going to be 35.4 feet long, 11.8 feet wide, and weigh 29 tons with its 5-man crew. It's definitely an interesting vehicle though. I'm not really sure it was actually that much of an improvement over the Type 3 though. Now, we know at least one prototype was made, but it's entirely possible more than one was actually made, as there's actually no surviving paperwork that actually says that only one was made. So we'll actually never really truly know, as most of the paperwork at this time was burnt. And of course, this is where this video will end, the very first Imperial era content. Please let me know if you liked this video. And I actually want to hear your opinion on these amphibious vehicles as well. Were they good? Were they bad? Are they cool? Let me know. I'd love to discuss it with you. I'll see you next time.